There is a word in Persian, caravanserai, that has no precise equivalent in English. It means, roughly, a place where caravans rest, an inn built at a day's journey from the last inn, so that the travellers and their animals could sleep and eat and water their horses and repair their equipment before continuing. But the word carries more than its literal meaning. It carries the smell of the place, smoke and animal sweat and spiced food, and the particular dry dustiness of 100 different roads, all arriving at the same courtyard. It carries the sound, a dozen languages spoken simultaneously, merchants arguing prices in Armenian and Sogdian and Chinese and Arabic and Greek, a storyteller somewhere in a corner of the courtyard, performing a tale that no one around him understands in full, but everyone around him is listening to. It carries the quality of the light, oil lamps burning in the arched niches of the courtyard walls, each lamp a small amber pool, and above the open centre of the courtyard, the stars of Central Asia, blazing with a ferocity that has to be seen to be believed. The Milky Way so bright in the dry air of the high plateau that it casts a shadow. I have spent a long time thinking about those courtyards, about what it meant to arrive at one after a week in the desert, or a month crossing the mountains, or 3 days on the steppe with nothing in any direction but grass and wind and the distant smear of another traveller's dust on the horizon, to arrive and find fire, to find food, to find other human beings who had come from somewhere you had never been and were going somewhere you might never go, and who carried with them, in their languages, in the goods strapped to their animals, in the stories they told, in the diseases they unknowingly harboured, the entirety of the civilized world. The Silk Road was not a road. This is the first thing to understand, and it matters, because the word road conjures something specific, a single path, a clear direction, a beginning and an end. The Silk Road was none of these things. It was a network, a vast, shifting, multi-stranded web of routes that connected the eastern edge of the known world to the western edge across 4,000 miles of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. It crossed the Taklamakan Desert, where the Chinese name means, with characteristic bleakness, you go in but you don't come out. It crossed the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where the passes sat above 4,000 meters, and travellers described their lips cracking from the altitude and their horses stumbling in the thin air. It crossed the Iranian plateau, the Mesopotamian river valleys, the Anatolian highlands, and finally descended to the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, where ships were waiting to carry the cargo further west. It crossed, depending on which route you took and which century you travelled in, through the lands of the Parthians and the Sassanids and the Kushans and the Sogdians and the Tang Chinese and the Byzantine Greeks and the Umayyad Arabs and dozens of smaller polities and kingdoms and nomadic confederacies whose names have not survived even in fragments. No one in the ancient or medieval world called it the Silk Road. The name was coined by a German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, in 1877. The people who actually travelled it had different names for different sections, or simply referred to the road to China, or the road from the west, depending on which direction they were going. The merchant from Samarkand heading east with a load of glass beads and silver did not think of himself as travelling the Silk Road. He thought of himself as making the run to Dunhuang, or to Turfan, or to Chang'an, because those were the places he knew, the places where the markets were, the places where his contacts would meet him and his accounts would be settled and his next load would be arranged. But from above, from the bird's eye view of history looking down, the network is visible. And what the network reveals is something that should astonish us more than it does. For nearly 1,000 years, from roughly the 1st century before the Common Era to roughly the 15th century, when the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople shifted the economics of east-west trade toward the sea routes that would become the age of exploration, the interior of the Eurasian continent was crossed continuously by human beings carrying goods and ideas between civilizations that had no other contact with each other. Chinese silk reached Rome, Roman glassware reached China. Buddhism travelled from India to China along these routes. Islam travelled from Arabia to Central Asia and beyond. The Black Death travelled from Central Asia to Europe, carried by fleas on rats in the cargo holds of ships that stopped at the same ports where the silk and the spice arrived. The Silk Road was not just a trade network, it was the circulatory system of the medieval world, and what flowed through it was everything. Not just luxury goods, but religion and disease and mathematics and music and story, and the slow, invisible, transformative exchange of ways of understanding what it means to be alive. I want to take you there, not to the whole road at once. The whole road at once is too large, too complex, too various to be held in a single account. I want to take you to specific moments on it, specific places, specific human beings who travelled it and were changed by it and who left behind, in objects, in texts, in the genetic record of populations, in the architecture of cities built along its routes, the evidence of what the network meant. I want to walk you slowly from east to west, stopping where the story requires stopping, staying as long as the place deserves. Begin in Chang'an. The capital of the Tang dynasty, in the 7th and 8th centuries, was the largest city in the world. Perhaps 1 million people within its walls, arranged in a grid of 108 rectangular wards. Each ward a neighbourhood with its own markets and temples and wells, the whole city organised with the geometric precision that the Tang state brought to everything it touched. The walls of Chang'an were enormous, 35 kilometres of rammed earth and brick, enclosing an area larger than any city in Europe would achieve, until London in the 17th century. The streets inside those walls were wide enough for 12 carts to drive abreast. The imperial palace at the northern end of the city occupied a fifth of the entire urban area. On the great feast days, lanterns were hung along the avenues for 3 nights, and the illuminated city was visible from the hills above it as something that could not quite be believed. But the thing about Chang'an that matters for this story is not its size or its geometry. It is the West Market. Every large city in the Tang Empire had 2 markets, the East Market for domestic goods and the West Market for foreign ones. And the West Market of Chang'an was one of the most extraordinary places in the medieval world. It occupied 2 of the city's rectangular wards, which means it was enormous, perhaps 1 kilometre on each side, and within it were gathered merchants from every civilization that the Silk Road connected. Sogdians, who were the great middlemen of the road in this period, operating trading colonies from Chang'an to Constantinople. Persians, who had been travelling to China since the Sassanid period. Arabs, whose presence in Chang'an increased dramatically after the Islamic conquest of Persia in the 7th century. Indians, Nestorian Christians from Mesopotamia, Jews from the diaspora communities along the road, Byzantines from the empire that the Tang court called Forlin, and whose ambassadors were received with the formal ceremony due to a power the Chinese regarded as roughly their equal at the western edge of the world, stand in the West Market of Chang'an in, let us say, the year 720. The market is open from noon to sunset, the hours regulated by the drum beats from the drum tower in the market's centre, which mark the opening and closing and the passage of the afternoon. The stalls and shops line the market's internal streets in an arrangement that is, typically for Tang urban planning, strictly regulated. The metal workers in one section, the clothiers in another, the perfumers, and there are many perfumers because aromatics from India and Arabia and Southeast Asia are among the most valuable commodities the road carries, in another section entirely. The noise is extraordinary, the smell is extraordinary. The specific perfume of a place where incense from Southeast Asia and spices from India and the leather of Central Asian saddle making and the metalwork of Persian craftsmen and the fermented grape of wine brought from Turfan all contribute their notes to an atmosphere that no person standing in it could fully pass. A Sogdian merchant named Nanavandak, we know names like this from the Sogdian letters, a cache of ancient correspondence found in a watchtower in the Dunhuang region in 1907, the oldest surviving personal letters in Central Asian history, has been in Chang'an for 6 months. He arrived from Samarkand with a load of silver, some lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan that always command high prices in the Chinese market, and a dozen bolts of the best Sogdian silk, which is a paradox, bringing silk to China. But the Sogdian silk is woven in patterns that Chinese buyers cannot replicate, geometric designs in deep crimson and midnight blue that the Tang court finds desirable precisely because of their foreignness. He has sold the lapis and most of the silver and negotiated a price for the silk with a Chinese merchant who acts as intermediary for a court official. Now he is arranging his return cargo, Chinese silk in the raw, ceramics, Tang ceramics, the white porcelain that is so new and so fine that nothing like it exists in the Western world yet. and bronze mirrors with their characteristic reverse cast designs. He is also arranging something less tangible. He has been attending the services at the Nestorian Christian Church in Ward 106, which was formally established in Chang'an in 635 with the permission of the Tang Emperor Tiazong. The tablet erected at the church's founding, which still survives in the stelly forest of Xi'an, one of the most extraordinary objects in Chinese history, is inscribed in both Chinese and Syriac, and it describes the arrival of the Christian faith in China as a great blessing brought from the West. Nani Vandak is not Christian himself. He maintains the Zoroastrian faith of his ancestors, and there are Zoroastrian temples in Chang'an too, and Buddhist temples, and Manichaean meeting houses, and Taoist shrines and Confucian academies, and the city contains all of these simultaneously, without, for much of the Tang period, finding the coexistence intolerable. But he knows the priests at the Nestorian Church, and he has been discussing with them the possibility of carrying several more priests westward with his caravan when he returns. Men who want to make the journey to the Nestorian Patriarch in Ctesiphon, and then perhaps further to the communities in Syria and Egypt. He will take them. He has done it before. The road carries religion as naturally as it carries silk. The caravan that leaves Chang'an heading west in the early spring contains, by the time it passes through the western gate of the city, perhaps 100 men and 300 animals. The animals are primarily camels, the Bactrian camel, the two-humped variety that is native to the high steppes and extraordinarily suited to the conditions of the Central Asian routes, capable of carrying heavy loads across both the cold of the mountain passes and the heat of the desert floors, capable of going without water for extended periods, and capable of navigating the soft sand of the desert in a way that a horse cannot. The camels are owned by different members of the caravan. Some men own their animals outright, some have borrowed against their cargoes to hire them. Some are guards or servants, travelling at another merchant's expense. A caravan of this size has its own internal hierarchy, its own rules, its own system for resolving disputes and distributing the burdens of the journey. The first leg of the journey west from Chang'an follows a well-established road through the Gansu corridor, a narrow strip of arable land between the Gobi Desert to the north and the Tibetan Plateau to the south, along which the Chinese imperial administration has maintained watchtowers and garrison towns since the Han Dynasty. The towers are visible from each other, close enough for fire signals to pass from one to the next, a chain of communication that can carry information from the westernmost outpost at Dunhuang to the Tang court in Chang'an in a matter of days. The garrison towns, places like Zhangye and Juquan, are not large, but they are comfortable by road standards, with inns and markets and the facilities for watering animals and repairing equipment. The road through the Gansu corridor is the tamest section of the journey, the section that most resembles a road in the conventional sense, and the merchants travel it quickly, covering 20 to 30 li a day, 20 miles more or less, in the good weather of spring. At Dunhuang, the road divided. Dunhuang was not merely a town, it was a gateway, the last town before the road entered the Taklamakan Desert, and it served for centuries as the logistical hub where caravans were assembled, supplies purchased, guides hired, and the crucial decision made about which route to take. The northern route skirted the northern edge of the Taklamakan, following the chain of oases fed by rivers descending from the Tian Shan Mountains, Turfan, Kutcha, Kashgar. The southern route skirted the southern edge, following the rivers descending from the Kunlun Mountains. Miran, Nia, Khotan, Yarkand, both routes converged again at Kashgar, where the Pamirs began. But the conditions of each were different, and the cities along each route were different, and the political situation along each route in any given year was different, which meant the choice at Dunhuang was a consequential one that a smart merchant made by gathering as much current intelligence as possible before committing. The Taklamakan is not the largest desert in the world, but it may be the most absolutely desolate. It is a basin, ringed by mountains on three sides, the Tian Shan to the north, the Pamirs to the west, the Kunlun to the south, and the mountains catch whatever moisture might otherwise reach the basin, leaving the interior absolutely dry, the driest part of the driest continent, the place where the Chinese name translates to "you go in but you don't come out." The dunes in the central Taklamakan reach a height of 300 meters. The temperature ranges from -20 in January to 45 in July. There is no water except at the oasis towns on the desert's edges, and the distances between those oases can be as large as 100 kilometers of absolute nothing. No water, no shade, no orientation, just sand and the wind and the sun and the memory of where you were going. The oasis towns that line the edges of the Taklamakan were not small villages. They were, at their peak, sophisticated urban centres, governed by their own dynasties, maintaining their own artistic and religious traditions, conducting their own foreign policies with the great powers that surrounded them. Khotan, on the southern route, was famous for its jade, the nephrite jade that the Chinese had valued since the Neolithic period, worked into ritual objects and jewellery by craftsmen who had been doing this work for longer than the Chinese imperial tradition itself. Khotan was also, by the time of the Tang, a major centre of Buddhist art, producing paintings and sculptures in a style that blended Indian, Iranian and Chinese elements into something that belonged entirely to the oasis world, something that existed nowhere else. Turfan, on the northern route, preserved an extraordinary archive of documents, Buddhist texts, administrative records, personal letters, contracts, even fragments of novels and drinking games, in the dry climate of its ancient cemetery sites. And these documents, recovered by archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, have given us one of the most vivid pictures anywhere in the ancient world of ordinary life along the Silk Road. Let me tell you about a man from Turfan. His name was Zhai Fengda, and he lived in the 7th century during the Tang occupation of the Turfan Basin. We know about him because his family archive survived in the dry climate of the ancient cemetery, discovered and excavated in the early 20th century. The archive contains, among other documents, a record of the loans Zhai Fengda made to his neighbours, small amounts of grain or silk or cash, carefully notarized, the borrower's name and the amount and the interest rate and the date of repayment, all recorded in the careful hand of a man who understood that memory is unreliable and paper is more permanent. We know from these documents that Zhai Fengda lent grain to a man who was making a journey to the west, that he lent silk to a woman whose husband had not returned from a caravan, that he lent money to a monk who was commissioning a painting for the local Buddhist monastery. The loans are small and the details are ordinary, and they are more vivid than almost any chronicle or official history, because they show the actual texture of daily life in an oasis town on the Silk Road in the 7th century. The ordinary economic relationships, the ordinary worries, the ordinary acts of neighbourly assistance and shrewd financial calculation that constituted a life. Beyond Turfan, beyond the other oasis towns of the Tarim Basin, the road climbed into the Pamirs. The Pamirs are not like any mountains most people in the lowland world have experienced. They are high plateau, a region where the land itself sits at an altitude that most mountains only achieve at their peaks. And above the plateau rise peaks that go to 7,000 and 8,000 metres and beyond. The passes through the Pamirs, the passes that the Silk Road travellers used, sit at 3,000 to 5,000 metres, high enough that travellers regularly describe symptoms of altitude sickness, headaches, nausea, the strange breathlessness that comes from air that contains too little oxygen. The Tang Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang, who crossed the Pamirs in 609 on his way to India to collect Buddhist texts, his journey is one of the best documented of all Silk Road accounts, and it became, centuries after his death, the basis for one of the greatest novels in Chinese literature, Journey to the West, described the crossing as the most difficult part of his entire journey, which had taken him across thousands of miles of desert and steppe. He described the cold as absolute, the passes as dangerous, and the descent into the Fergana Valley on the western side as a revelation of warmth and greenery after the high frozen world of the mountains, the Fergana Valley. If the Silk Road has a heart, geographically and historically, it is somewhere in the great central swath of what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and Afghanistan, the region that the ancients called Transoxiana, the land beyond the Oxus River, and that the Arab conquerors called Ma'urana, and that the world map of medieval Islamic cartographers placed at the centre of the known world, not as an error, but as a statement about where the real centre of the Eurasian trading network lay. The cities of this region, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Balkh, were not peripheral towns on a road between more important places. They were the road's great nodes, the places where the different routes converged and where the real business of the Silk Road was conducted, Samarkand above all. Samarkand is a name that has been carrying a weight of romantic association since antiquity. The Greeks knew it as Maracanda, the city that Alexander the Great occupied in 329 BCE, and where he killed his closest friend Cletus in a drunken argument, the event that marked the beginning of his psychological unravelling. It sat at the confluence of trade routes from every direction: east toward China, west toward Persia and the Mediterranean, south toward India, north toward the steppes where the nomadic confederacies controlled the movement of horses and furs and slaves. Its markets were the market of markets, the place where everything that moved along every branch of the network was available simultaneously. The Sogdians, who dominated Silk Road trade from the 3rd to the 8th century, were Samarkand's people. Or rather, they were the people of the entire region of Sogdia, centered on Samarkand and Bukhara, and the cities of the Zerashan Valley. They were Iranian-speaking, Zoroastrian in their ancestral religion, extraordinarily gifted at languages. A Sogdian merchant might speak Chinese and Turkish and Parthian and Sanskrit in addition to his own language, and organized into trading networks that stretched from Chang'an in the east to Constantinople in the west, held together by family ties and religious community, and the system of credit and debt that allowed a merchant to leave Samarkand with goods and return with payment without ever carrying silver through the dangerous mountain passes. The Sogdian merchant communities in the cities along the road were not merely trading posts. They were permanent settlements, with their own temples and their own legal systems and their own social hierarchies, integrated into the local economies they operated in, while maintaining connections to the home communities in Sogdia. When the Arabs conquered Sogdia in the 8th century and the Sogdian political structure was destroyed, the trading networks the Sogdians had built survived, absorbed into the commercial life of the new Islamic world, because the networks were not the product of the Sogdian state, but of Sogdian families, and families are harder to destroy than states. Let me stop in Samarkand for a moment. Let me try to give you the city as it was. In the early 8th century, Samarkand was governed by a lord called the Ikshid, a Sogdian title meaning king or ruler, and the Ikshid's palace, which archaeologists excavated in the mid-20th century at a site called Afrasiab, north of the modern city, was decorated with frescoes that are among the most extraordinary works of art to survive from the ancient world. The frescoes show the reception of ambassadors from all the civilizations of the known world. Chinese ambassadors in their formal robes presenting gifts, Indian ambassadors with their elephants, Turkish rulers on horseback, a procession of women on boats in what appears to be a Korean landscape. The frescoes are damaged, they were covered and forgotten when the Mongols sacked Samarkand in the 13th century, and were not rediscovered until the Soviet period. But enough survives to make the point with absolute clarity. The Ikshid of Samarkand, in the early 8th century, received the world. The world came to Samarkand, and when it came, the Ikshid had it painted on his walls, so that the cosmopolitan reality of his court would be permanently visible to everyone who entered it. Those paintings are also a kind of evidence that the Silk Road was not merely an economic phenomenon, not merely a network for the exchange of commodities. It was the medium through which the visual cultures of different civilizations encountered each other and changed each other. The painting style of the Afrasiab frescoes is itself a synthesis. The figural representation owes something to Iranian art, something to Indian Buddhist painting, something to the Chinese tradition, the way the artists handled drapery, the way they represented horses, the color palette they used. All of these show the traces of multiple traditions meeting and influencing each other through the continuous traffic of objects and craftsmen along the road. You cannot look at a Tang dynasty camel figurine in terracotta without seeing the Central Asian influence in the way the camel is loaded with a foreign merchant's goods. You cannot look at the Buddhist paintings in the Dunhuang cave temples without seeing the Indian origin of the iconography filtered through multiple Central Asian styles. You cannot look at the Sassanid silver plates that arrived in China and are preserved in Chinese collections without seeing the Chinese decorative elements that the craftsmen added to please their export market. The Silk Road was a machine for producing hybrid culture, for creating art that belonged to no single tradition, but to the encounter between traditions. Merv. Before we continue west, we must stop at Merv. Merv sits in what is now southern Turkmenistan, in the Murghab River Delta, and it has been inhabited since at least 3000 BCE. By the early medieval period, it was one of the largest cities in the world. Some estimates put its population in the 10th century at 200,000 or more, making it comparable to Baghdad and Constantinople as one of the great cities of the medieval Islamic world. It was a centre of scholarship. The mathematician and poet Omar Khayyam spent time there, and the libraries of Merv were said to hold treasures of Greek and Persian and Indian learning. It was a centre of textile production, famous for the silks and cottons that bore its name in the markets of the Mediterranean. It was a caravanserai city, a city whose entire economy was organised around the flow of caravans through it, with inns and warehouses and markets and money changers and all the infrastructure of trade on an intercontinental scale. Merv was destroyed by the Mongols in 1221. The destruction of Merv is one of the better documented examples of what Mongol conquest meant for the cities it reached. The Persian historian Juzjani, writing a generation after the event, estimated that the Mongols killed 700,000 people when they sacked the city. This number is almost certainly exaggerated. It was a common feature of medieval chronicle writing to inflate casualty figures dramatically. But the scale of the destruction was real. The irrigation systems that had made the Murghab Delta farmable were destroyed along with the city, and without irrigation, the farmland turned to desert. Merv never recovered. The ruins of the ancient city sit in the desert of southern Turkmenistan today, enormous and mostly unexcavated, the outlines of its walls visible in the dry landscape. The city that was once larger than contemporary London reduced to earth mounds and silence. The destruction of Merv was one moment in the larger catastrophe of the Mongol conquests, which in the 13th century destroyed the urban civilization of Central Asia, with a thoroughness that the region has never fully recovered from. The cities that had sustained the Silk Road network for 1,000 years, Merv, Nishapur, Balkh, Samarkand itself, though Samarkand was rebuilt, were burned or abandoned or reduced to fractions of their former size. The population of the region may have declined by 50% in a generation. The irrigation systems on which the agricultural surplus that fed the cities depended were destroyed and were not rebuilt, and without the agricultural surplus, the cities could not be sustained, and without the cities, the road lost its nodes, and without the nodes, the network began to contract. But before the catastrophe, the road continued west. From Merv, the route descended into the Iranian plateau, through Nishapur, and then through the passes to Ray, near modern Tehran, and then south and west through the Iranian heartland toward the Tigris and the Euphrates and the great cities of Mesopotamia. Ketafen, the Sassanid capital, was for centuries the western end of the road's first great leg, the Sassanid Empire being the political power that controlled the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, and that was the great intermediary between the eastern and western halves of the network, the power that could, and sometimes did, restrict or tax the passage of goods in ways that drove the Eastern Roman Empire to look for alternative routes. The tension between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire over the control of silk. The Byzantine court wanted silk for its court ceremonial and could not produce it. The Sassanids controlled the route through which it arrived from China and could set the price, is one of the defining geopolitical tensions of the 6th century. And it drove the Byzantines to extraordinary lengths. They sent monks to China to smuggle out silkworm eggs, establishing a Byzantine silk industry that reduced their dependence on the Sassanid middlemen. Silkworms in the hollow of a walking staff, brought from China to Constantinople in the reign of Justinian. The monks who accomplished this smuggling operation did not write about their feelings as they concealed the eggs that would end the Chinese monopoly on silk production and transform the textile industry of the Mediterranean world in the hollows of their walking staves. We know the broad outlines of the story from Procopius, who was writing history in Constantinople while it was happening, and from later Byzantine chronicles. The specific detail of the hollow staff is vivid enough that it reads as something actually witnessed rather than invented, but the names of the monks are not recorded. They accomplished one of the most consequential acts of industrial espionage in the history of the ancient world and disappeared back into the anonymity from which history occasionally pulls specific individuals for a moment before releasing them again. Let me give you one more specific human being. Her name was Sogdak, and she was a Sogdian woman living in the 6th century, and we know about her from a letter, the Sogdian letters from the watchtower near Dunhuang again. That cache of personal correspondence that gives us the closest thing to a direct human voice from the Silk Road world. Sogdak wrote to her mother in Samarkand from somewhere in China, and her letter is one of the most startling documents to survive from the ancient world, because it is written in the direct, unguarded language of a woman in distress to the person she trusts most. She had been left behind, she writes, by her husband, who had gone further east on a trading journey and had not returned. She was out of money. The merchant she had been travelling with had refused to help her. She was reduced, she says, to working as a servant. She wants to come home. She asks her mother to send money. She says, in a phrase that reaches across 1500 years with complete legibility, "I would rather be a dog or a pig in Samarkand than what I am here." Sogdak, a woman in the 6th century, on the Silk Road, out of money and out of hope, writing to her mother. The letter never reached its destination. It was found in the watchtower, where it had been abandoned with a cache of other correspondence, perhaps left when the carrier was waylaid or died on the road. Sogdak's mother never knew what had become of her daughter. We do not know what became of Sogdak. The letter exists. The letter is all. Sogdak's letter is dated to around 3113 CE. It was written on a piece of Sogdian paper which was then still a recent Chinese invention not yet widely available in the West. A detail that tells you something about where on the road you are and what period you are in. The letter was never sent, or was sent and never arrived. It sat in a watchtower for 16 centuries, perfectly preserved by the dry Dunhuang air, and then a British explorer found it and sent it to London, and scholars spent decades learning to read the Sogdian script in which it was written, and now it sits in the British Library, where anyone who cares to look can read its digital facsimile. Sogdak's desperation, her specific phrasing, the weight of her homesickness, all of it preserved in the dry air of the Silk Road desert, delivered 16 centuries late to readers she never imagined. The road produced this. Not just the silk and the Buddhism and the plague and the mathematics, but the specific human record of the specific human lives that the road both enabled and destroyed. The letters, the accounts, the contracts, the occasional diary or memoir. These are the road's most intimate artifacts, the residue of individual people whose names we might otherwise never know, surfacing from the desert or from the archive of a monastery to say, "I was here, I travelled this road, I was frightened and poor and far from home and I wanted my mother." This is the other face of the Silk Road, the face that the romantic telling of the story tends to overlook. The glamour belongs to the network, to the scale of the exchange, to the civilizational encounters, and the transmission of ideas and religions and technologies across 4,000 miles of some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. But the road was made of individual human lives, and many of those lives were difficult and frightening and ended badly. The desert took people, the mountain passes took people, the bandits that preyed on caravans took people. Disease, the same vectors of transmission that carried Buddhism and Islam along the road, also carried smallpox and plague, took people. The political disruptions that periodically closed sections of the road when a warring dynasty or an aggressive nomadic confederation made certain routes impassable, took people who had planned on one route and arrived at a closed gate. The Black Death travelled the Silk Road. This is worth pausing on, because the connection between the Great Trade Network and the greatest demographic catastrophe in recorded history is both real and complex. The plague, Yersinia pestis, appears to have been endemic in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe for centuries, periodically spilling over into human populations and causing local outbreaks. What changed in the mid-14th century was that a particularly virulent outbreak, probably originating around the 1330s in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now Kyrgyzstan. There are graves from this period with inscriptions noting death from pestilence, spread into the trading routes of the Silk Road. The Mongol Empire, which at its peak in the 13th century had unified much of the Silk Road network under a single political umbrella, had created conditions of relatively easy movement across the steppe routes, and this same ease of movement that had accelerated trade also accelerated the spread of disease. The plague travelled west along the trading routes, reaching the Crimean port of Kaffa by the 1340s, where Genoese merchants, who operated the great Italian trading post in the Black Sea, encountered it. When the Mongol army besieging Kaffa catapulted plague corpses over the city walls, and the Genoese ships fled back to Italian ports carrying infected crew members and cargo. They brought with them the Black Death that would kill perhaps a third of the population of Europe. A disease that had lived in the steppe rodents of Central Asia for centuries travelled the network that silk and Buddhism and mathematics had travelled, and arrived in the ports of the Mediterranean to end what silk and Buddhism and mathematics had begun. The same road, the same ports, the same network of human connection that made civilization possible also made its worst catastrophe inevitable. But the road endured. Even the Black Death did not end it. The Great Plague of the 14th century was catastrophic for the populations it reached, but it did not destroy the cities of Central Asia in the way the Mongol conquests had, and in the century and a half between the plague and the final closure of the overland routes, the road continued to function. The Timurid dynasty, which rose to power in Central Asia in the late 14th century under Tamerlane in the European tradition, rebuilt Samarkand with an ambition that was, in its way, a continuation of the old Sogdian logic. Make the city magnificent, make the markets rich, make the craftsmen skilled and the scholars welcome, and the trade will come. Timur brought craftsmen from every city he conquered, from Baghdad, from Delhi, from Damascus, from Izmir, and installed them in Samarkand, where they produced the extraordinary architecture and tile work and manuscript painting that characterized the Timurid period. The road still went through Samarkand, the caravans still came, the caravanserai still burnt their lamps. What ended the Silk Road was not a catastrophe, but an alternative. When Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and arrived in India, he opened a sea route between Europe and Asia that bypassed the overland network entirely. The sea route was cheaper, it could carry more cargo per unit of cost. It avoided the taxes and tolls levied at each political boundary along the overland road, and it was faster in the sense that a single long voyage, however dangerous, eliminated the long series of transactions and transshipments that the overland route required. Within a generation of da Gama's voyage, the Portuguese were carrying spices from India to Lisbon in quantities that made the overland route economically uncompetitive. Within another generation, the overland route had declined from the great artery of the medieval world to a secondary network of local trade. The caravans still ran, they run in parts of Central Asia today, but they no longer carried the world's most valuable goods between its greatest civilizations. That traffic had gone to sea. The cities along the route felt the change immediately. Samarkand declined. Merv, which had been slowly rebuilding since the Mongol conquest, stopped growing and began to empty again. Kashgar remained significant as a regional centre, but lost its position as a node in a global network. The caravanserais along the desert routes fell into disrepair, their courtyards emptied, their lamps unlit, the oil in the lamp niches hardening and finally turning to dust over the long centuries after the last caravan had passed. Some of the caravanserais are still standing. You can visit them in Iran, in Anatolia, in Central Asia, enormous structures of stone and brick, sometimes beautifully decorated with tile work or carved geometric patterns. The central courtyard open to the sky as it always was, the arched niches where the lamps once burned, now empty and dark. Standing in one of them, in the silence of the desert or the silence of the steppe, you can feel the presence of what was there, not the specific people, not the specific conversations, not the specific cargoes, but the shape of the institution. The walls still stand. The courtyard still opens to the sky. At night, I imagine, the stars are still the stars of Central Asia, blazing in the dry air above the open centre of the courtyard, the same stars that the merchants and pilgrims and monks and soldiers and refugees looked up at for 1,000 years as they rested here on the way from one world to another. What the Silk Road transmitted, what it accomplished in its 1,000 years of operation, is still with us in ways we do not always recognise. The Buddhism that shaped the civilizations of East and Southeast Asia arrived along the Silk Road, carried by monks and merchants who moved between India and China in both directions across the mountain passes. The mathematics of the Islamic world, itself transmitted from the Indian and Greek traditions, synthesized and extended in the great centers of Central Asian scholarship, arrived in medieval Europe through the same network, transformed into what we call Arabic numerals, which are actually Indian in origin, and arrived in Europe via the Islamic civilization of Spain and Sicily, itself connected to the Silk Road network through the trade routes of the Islamic world. The printing technique that China developed in the 11th century and that transformed the production of books in East Asia was transmitted through some combination of direct contact and independent development to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe, where Gutenberg's press in the 15th century began the transformation of knowledge and power that we call the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. Paper itself, the medium on which all of this was possible, was a Chinese invention that travelled west along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world in the 8th century and Europe in the 10th, gradually replacing papyrus and vellum as the substrate of written civilization. These are large things, but the Silk Road transmitted small things too. The lute, the musical instrument that became the central instrument of medieval European music, and whose name preserves in the Arabic definite article, al-oud, the oud. The memory of its transmission from the Middle East to Europe travelled the road. The game of chess, invented in India, reached Europe through the Islamic world via the same routes. The apricot, the peach, the lemon, fruits that are now basic elements of European cuisine, arrived in the Mediterranean world along the road from the east. The rose, which was first cultivated in Persia and Central Asia, arrived in Europe as a cultivated plant rather than a wild one through the same transmission. The stirrup, the technological innovation that transformed cavalry warfare in the early medieval period, spread from China or Central Asia through the nomadic peoples of the steppe and into Europe with consequences that have been debated ever since. These things, the Buddhist scripture and the game of chess and the apricot and the stirrup, are the texture of what the road carried, not just the luxury goods that made the merchants rich, but the slow, continuous, often invisible transmission of ways of doing things and ways of understanding things across 4,000 miles and 1,000 years. The road was not primarily about silk. Silk was what the Romans wanted and what gave the road its name. But silk was one commodity among hundreds, and the commodities were only part of what moved. What moved was civilization itself. Not one civilization, but many, in contact with each other, changing each other, producing through their encounters something that none of them would have produced alone. I wish you a calm and peaceful night, but I have been moving too quickly. The road deserves a slower pace. Let me go back to the desert, back to the mountain passes, back to the specific quality of the experience of travelling this network. Because the history of the Silk Road is too often told from above, from the bird's eye view of trade statistics and dynastic chronologies and the long arcs of cultural transmission. The road was also experienced from the ground, from the saddle, or walking beside the camel that carried your goods, or sitting in the doorway of a caravanserai, watching the stars come out above the open courtyard, and listening to the night sounds of 100 animals and the murmur of a dozen languages settling into sleep around you. The desert, the Taklamakan, which I have already named, but which deserves more time than I have given it. The travellers who wrote about crossing it, and there are many of them, because the Silk Road produced an extraordinary tradition of travel writing, from the Chinese pilgrims who went to India for Buddhist texts, to the Islamic geographers who mapped the network from above, to the merchants who occasionally set down in letters or memoirs something of what the road felt like, describe it with a consistency that suggests they are all responding to the same overwhelming reality, the silence. This is the first thing they mention, the silence of the desert interior, which is not the absence of sound but a quality of silence that has a presence, a weight, a texture. Wind moves over the dunes and makes a sound, a low, continuous susurration that the desert travellers describe as strange and sometimes as frightening, as if the desert is speaking in a language you cannot understand, the mirages. The Taklamakan is a mirage desert, a place where the temperature differentials between the superheated sand surface and the air above it produce optical illusions of extraordinary persuasiveness. Cities in the distance, lakes of shimmering water, forests of date palms. The traveller who has been walking for 3 days and sees a city on the horizon does not have the luxury of certainty that it is real. He has to keep going and find out. And when the city dissolves as he approaches, when it was never there, when the shimmer that looked like a lake resolves into burning sand, the psychological cost is real and cumulative. The Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang crossing a desert section of his journey, describes seeing demons and ghost soldiers on the horizon and hearing strange voices. And these are almost certainly the hallucinations of a man severely dehydrated and sleep-deprived and frightened in a landscape that offers no orientation and no mercy. He kept going because he had a purpose that was larger than his fear. The oasis towns are difficult to fully understand if you have not experienced the desert from which they emerge. Coming into Dunhuang, or Khotan, or Turfan, or any of the oases along the Silk Road routes, after days of desert crossing, was not merely arriving at a town, it was returning to the world. The green of the trees visible from a distance across the flat desert floor, the sound of water in the irrigation channels, the smell of bread baking, the sight of walls, architecture, the human imposition on the landscape that says, here, human beings have decided to remain. The exhausted traveller arriving at the gate of a Silk Road oasis town was experiencing something close to resurrection. The world had ended in the desert, and now it was beginning again. Let me tell you more about Xuanzang, because he deserves more than a passing mention. He left Chang'an in 629, without imperial permission, which was illegal, slipping out through the city's western gate in the early morning before the guards were fully awake. And he returned 17 years later with 657 Buddhist texts on 22 horses, texts that he spent the rest of his life translating into Chinese. He was, in terms of what he accomplished and what it cost him, one of the great travellers in human history. He crossed the Gobi Desert alone, losing his only water container in the first days and nearly dying of thirst before his horse found an oasis by instinct. He crossed the Tian Shan mountains in snow, losing a third of his party to the cold in a single pass. He was robbed, he was captured, he was escorted by kings who could not believe that a single Chinese monk had actually walked to their court from Chang'an through everything that lay between. He kept going because he believed that the texts he was seeking were worth everything it cost to reach them. When he reached India, after crossing the full length of Central Asia, descending through the Khyber Pass, crossing the Indus and the plains of what is now Pakistan, he spent 15 years in study at the great Buddhist University of Nalanda, sitting at the feet of scholars who were the inheritors of a tradition that China had received only in fragments and translations of dubious quality. He learnt Sanskrit so fluently that he could debate the finest points of Buddhist philosophy with the best scholars in India, and the Indian scholars who heard him were reportedly astonished that a foreigner from the East could reach such depths of understanding. He collected the texts he came for and began the long journey back. When he finally reached Chang'an in 645, the Emperor Taizong, who had initially wanted to prosecute him for leaving without permission, instead received him with honour, recognizing that what Xuanzang had brought back was worth more than the law he had broken to obtain it. The texts Xuanzang translated shaped Chinese Buddhism for the next 14 centuries. His account of his journey, the Great Tang Records on the Western regions, is one of the primary historical sources for the study of Central Asian and Indian civilization in the 7th century. He walked every mile. This matters. The Silk Road was not experienced at the speed of abstraction, but at the speed of a man walking beside a horse or riding a camel in the summer heat, or stumbling through a mountain pass in the snow. Distance on the road was measured in the body's experience of it, the number of days, the number of water sources, the number of times the terrain changed from passable to difficult to nearly impossible and back again. The road was not a metaphor, it was a physical fact, experienced by physical human beings at the pace of their capacity to endure it. The Mogao Caves at Dunhuang are the most extraordinary single artifact of the Silk Road that survives. They are a complex of cave temples carved into the cliffs of a dry river valley near the town, created over a period of approximately 1,000 years, beginning in the 4th century of the Common Era, by generations of Buddhist patrons who commissioned the carving and the decoration as acts of religious merit. There are nearly 500 of these caves, and almost all of them are decorated with paintings. Elaborate, narrative, technically sophisticated paintings covering every surface of every cave, telling the stories of the Buddhist scriptures in the visual language of the Central Asian tradition, which is itself a synthesis of Indian and Iranian and Chinese and nomadic steppe influences. The paintings in the Mogao Caves are the most comprehensive visual record of Silk Road civilization that exists anywhere, because they were created over the centuries of the road's operation by artists who were living in and responding to the cosmopolitan world of the road. In one of the sealed libraries at Mogao, a cave whose entrance had been plastered over around the year 1000 and not reopened until 1900, when a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu broke through the plaster and found inside approximately 40,000 manuscripts, scrolls, paintings, and textiles preserved by the dry Dunhuang climate, were the texts that gave us more direct human voices from the Silk Road than any other single source. The Sogdian letters I mentioned, Buddhist texts in Chinese and Tibetan and Sogdian and Sanskrit, administrative documents from the Tang occupation of the Dunhuang region, the world's oldest printed book, the Diamond Sutra, dated to 868 CE, printed using woodblock printing more than 500 years before Gutenberg, and personal documents, the contracts, the accounts, the letters that give us Jai Fengda and his loans, Sogdak and her desperation, the individual lives that the historical record so rarely preserves. Wang Yuanlu did not know what he had found. He was illiterate, or nearly so, and could not read the manuscripts. He tried to alert the local authorities to the find, but the Qing dynasty administration in its last years was not in a position to respond to an obscure monk's report of a cave full of old papers in a remote corner of Gansu. When the explorer Aurel Stein arrived at Dunhuang in 1907, he recognized immediately what the cave held, and through a combination of scholarly enthusiasm, personal persuasion, and financial inducement, convinced Wang Yuanlu to allow him to remove approximately 10,000 manuscripts and paintings, which he sent to the British Museum in London, where they still are. The French sinologist Paul Pelliot arrived shortly afterward and took another 6,000 or so, now in Paris. Japanese and Russian expeditions followed. What remained was eventually moved to a library in Lanzhou and then to Beijing. The manuscripts are now scattered across institutions on 4 continents, available in digital form to scholars who can read the dozen languages in which they are written, their contents yielding new information about the Silk Road world with every generation of scholarship. The caves themselves are still at Dunhuang. They are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, carefully conserved, the paintings protected from the humidity introduced by the breathing of tourists by elaborate environmental controls. Visitors move through some of the caves in small groups with guides, looking at the paintings in the light of carefully positioned lamps. The paintings are too light sensitive for the kind of bright illumination that would make every detail visible, and so you see them in a partial light that is actually not unlike the light of the oil lamps that originally illuminated them, when monks and travellers came to pray in these caves on their way through Dunhuang in the Tang dynasty. In that light, the paintings seem very close. Not historical artifacts, but living things, responding to the light the way they were designed to respond to light. The story of the road from Dunhuang westward I have already sketched. The crossing of the Taklamakan, the city of Kashgar at the foot of the Pamirs, the crossing of the Pamirs themselves, the descent into the Fergana Valley. But let me pause at Kashgar for a moment, because Kashgar and its medieval peak was one of the most interesting cities on the road, a city at the meeting point of routes coming from China, from India over the Karakoram passes, from the Pamirs and Central Asia to the west, and from the steppe world to the north. Its Sunday market, which still operates today, much diminished from its medieval scale, but still one of the largest weekly markets in Central Asia, was where these routes met in practice, where the goods from all 4 directions were traded, and where the merchants from all 4 directions encountered each other in the weekly ritual of commerce. The Sunday market at Kashgar in its medieval peak would have contained, in a single space, Chinese silk and Tibetan wool, and Indian cotton, and Central Asian horses and steppe furs, and Levantine glass and Arab silver, and everything else that moved along the network. The animal market, horses and camels and donkeys, the living technology of the road, was the most important section for travelling merchants, because the quality of your animals was the quality of your journey, and the animals you could buy or hire or trade for at Kashgar would determine whether you crossed the Pamirs in reasonable safety or left your bones in the mountain snow. The horse breeders of the Fergana Valley, to the west of Kashgar, produced the most prized horses in the Silk Road world, large, strong animals that the Chinese called blood-sweating horses, because of a parasite that caused skin lesions that bled, and that the Han Emperor Wudi valued so highly that he sent armies across Central Asia specifically to obtain breeding stock. The horses of Fergana shaped Chinese cavalry, and therefore Chinese military history for centuries, because Chinese horses were small steppe ponies unsuited to heavy cavalry. And the Fergana horses gave Chinese armies the capability they had been lacking: horses for silk. This was the basic equation that governed the relationship between China and Central Asia for the entire period of the Silk Road's operation. China produced silk that Central Asia and the Western world wanted. Central Asia produced horses that China needed. The exchange was not always conducted through peaceful commerce. There were periods of Chinese imperial expansion into Central Asia designed to secure the horse supply, and periods of steppe confederacy pressure on the Chinese frontier designed to extract silk as tribute. But the underlying exchange was real and continuous. Silk went west, horses went east, and along the routes that carried silk and horses, everything else travelled too. Let me now take you west of the Pamirs, into the world of Islam. The Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century and of Central Asia in the early 8th century transformed the western half of the Silk Road network in ways that were ultimately positive for the road's operation. The unified Islamic world of the Umayyad and then Abbasid caliphates created a political space within which trade could move more freely than it had in the fragmented political landscape of pre-Islamic Central Asia. But the transition was violent, and the violence left marks. The Sogdians, who had been the great operators of the network in the pre-Islamic period, resisted the Arab conquest fiercely, and there were massacres in the Sogdian cities. But the Sogdians were also pragmatic, and many of them converted to Islam and continued their trading activities within the new political framework. The Abbasid Caliphate, which replaced the Umayyad in 750, was more genuinely cosmopolitan than its predecessor, drawing on Persian administrative traditions and welcoming converts of all backgrounds into the political class. The capital it established at Baghdad in 762 became the new western hub of the road, replacing Ctesiphon, and Baghdad at its height in the 9th century, with its 1,000,000 inhabitants, its great market of the Kark, its libraries and hospitals, and the House of Wisdom, where Greek and Indian and Persian texts were translated into Arabic, was the intellectual and commercial centre of the Islamic world, and one of the 2 or 3 greatest cities on earth. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, which I mentioned in the Alexandria script, deserves fuller treatment here because it was, in its way, the Silk Road's intellectual expression. The place where the knowledge that had travelled along the network from India and Greece and Persia and China was gathered and synthesized and transformed into the corpus of Islamic science that would eventually reach medieval Europe and provide the foundation for the scientific revolution. The scholars who worked in the House of Wisdom translated Euclid and Archimedes into Arabic, and in doing so preserved mathematical texts that might otherwise have been lost. They translated the Indian mathematical texts that introduced the decimal number system, what we now call Arabic numerals, into the Islamic world. They translated Greek medical texts and extended them with Arabic observations and experiment. They engaged with Chinese astronomical records and Indian astronomical calculations, synthesizing these with the Greek tradition to produce the astronomical scholarship that Copernicus would read in Latin translation in the 16th century, and that would help him understand that the Earth moved around the sun. All of this was possible because the road existed. The road brought the text to Baghdad, or rather, the scholars who had studied the texts came to Baghdad, or the manuscripts that contained the texts were carried along the road by travellers who understood their value. And the House of Wisdom was where the synthesis happened. Take away the road, and you take away the connection between the civilizations whose intellectual traditions, in contact with each other, produced the House of Wisdom. Take away the House of Wisdom, and you delay, by unknown decades or centuries, the intellectual developments that would eventually produce the scientific revolution in Europe. The road was not merely a commercial phenomenon, it was the nervous system of Eurasian intellectual life. West of Baghdad, the road continued to the Mediterranean, to the ports of the Levant, where the goods from the east were loaded onto ships for the final leg of the journey to Constantinople and the Italian city-states and the markets of northern Europe. But the road also went north from Baghdad, through Anatolia to Constantinople itself, and east from the Mediterranean coast by sea to Alexandria, which even in its diminished post-classical state remained a major port. Constantinople, the Byzantine capital that I described in the previous story, was the great terminus of the road from the west, the city where the merchants who had come all the way from Chang'an, or more likely from Samarkand or Merv or Baghdad, finally delivered their goods to the markets that supplied the richest consumers in the Western world. The Byzantine silk trade is a story of its own. The Byzantine court consumed silk in enormous quantities, for ceremonial robes, for church vestments, for diplomatic gifts, for the symbolic fabric of imperial authority that required that the emperor and his court be visibly more magnificent than any mere human power. After Justinian's monks brought the silkworm eggs from China in the 6th century, the Byzantine state had its own silk production, but it also continued to import Chinese and Central Asian silk, partly because the Byzantine silk could not match the quality of the best Chinese production, and partly because the specific designs available in the imported silk had a cachet that domestic production could not replicate. The court workshops in Constantinople produced silk to imperial specifications. The markets of Constantinople sold silk from every source in the known world. The Byzantine Empire was simultaneously a producer and a consumer, and a conduit for silk, positioned at the western end of the network in a way that mirrored Dunhuang's position at the eastern end. The specific quality of Byzantine silk, the heavy, stiff brocade woven with gold thread that the Byzantine court favoured for its most formal occasions, is something that can still be experienced in museums that hold examples of it. The silk is heavy in the hand, heavier than you expect, the gold thread adding weight as well as brilliance. The designs are formal, geometric, occasionally figurative, eagles, lions, the patterns that conveyed imperial authority in a visual language that required no literacy to read. These silks travelled in both directions. Byzantine silk went east along the road as gifts from the Byzantine court to the rulers of the Silk Road cities, and examples of Byzantine textiles have been found in excavations from Dunhuang to Merv, evidence of the reciprocal flow of luxury goods that was the road's most visible characteristic. Now let me bring you back to the caravanserai. Let me end there, in the courtyard, with the stars above, and the lamps in the niches, and the sound of the city of Babel, compressed into a single enclosed space for the night. The caravanserai was not merely a logistical convenience, it was, in its daily operation, a living demonstration of what the road meant. In the courtyard of a caravanserai, on any night of the road's operation, you would find people who had nothing in common except the direction they were travelling and the need for shelter. A Chinese merchant going west with silk, a Sogdian merchant going east with silver, a Buddhist monk from India going north toward China, a Nestorian Christian priest going west toward Baghdad, a Turkish nomad with a string of horses for sale, a refugee from a city that had been sacked by some army that had passed through, carrying whatever could be carried, a scholar with a manuscript in a language no one else in the courtyard could read. These people could not all talk to each other. The linguistic variety of the road was extraordinary, and the polyglot merchants who could move easily between 4 or 5 languages were exceptional rather than typical. But they shared the space, they shared the fire, they ate often from the same pots, because the caravanserai cook made food in quantity, and people ate together in the way that people eating at the same place at the same time inevitably end up eating together. They looked at each other's goods. You could not help looking, in the close quarters of the caravanserai courtyard, at what the person next to you was carrying, and the goods themselves were ambassadors of their origins, broadcasting the visual culture of distant places to eyes that had never seen those places and might never see them. The storytellers came to the caravanserais. The caravanserai was the natural environment for a storyteller, because there was always an audience, a captive audience, people who had nothing else to do for the night, and the audience was always diverse, which was a challenge and an opportunity. You could not tell a story that depended on cultural knowledge your audience lacked. You had to find the stories that were universal, the stories whose appeal required no prior knowledge, no shared culture, no specific language. This pressure, applied continuously across centuries of caravanserai storytelling, produced a body of narrative that was genuinely portable, that could travel the road as easily as silk or horses or plague. The story of the clever merchant who outwits the king, the story of the princess who sets impossible tasks for her suitors, the story of the young man who goes on a journey and returns transformed, These stories are not Chinese, or Indian, or Persian, or Arab. They are the road stories, shaped by the road's conditions, stripped of everything that did not travel. Some of these stories eventually made their way into the collections that we know. The Arabian Nights, the Jataka tales, the Persian romance traditions, transformed and elaborated by the literary cultures that collected them, but retaining at their core the shape of the road narrative, the journey structure, the encounter with the foreign and the strange, the return with something that could not have been obtained at home. When we read the Arabian Nights, we are reading, in part, the residue of 1,000 years of caravanserai storytelling. The stories that survived because they worked, because they could be told to any audience in any language, and still produce the recognition that a good story produces in its listener, the sensation of having been shown something true about the world. There is one more thing I want to give you before we leave the road. It is not a place or a person, but a sound, or rather, the idea of a sound. The camel bells. Every caravan of any size on the Silk Road travelled to the sound of camel bells, small bronze or iron bells hung from the necks of the lid camels, the sound carrying forward into the desert ahead and backward along the line of the caravan, keeping the animals aware of each other in conditions of low visibility, and announcing the caravan's presence to anyone within earshot. The sound of camel bells has been described by every traveller who ever crossed the Central Asian deserts, from Xuanzang in the 7th century to Orel Stein in the 20th. It is a specific sound, not the rich resonance of a church bell or the sharp ring of a small handbell, but a lower, more complex, slightly discordant sound that many bells of slightly different sizes make together. The kind of sound that carries far in dry desert air, and that the ear, once it has heard it, does not easily forget. The sound of the camel bells was the sound of the road. It was what the villagers in the oasis towns heard approaching, what told them that a caravan was coming and the market would be full tomorrow. It was what the bandits heard and followed, and what the guards heard and paid attention to. It was what the lonely traveller, lost in the desert, heard in the distance and turned toward with something close to religious gratitude. The camel bells were the road's announcement of itself, its declaration that it was not merely a geographical feature, but a living thing, a continuous movement of human beings and their animals and their goods and their ideas across the face of the earth. I cannot give you the sound, but I can tell you that it was there, for 1,000 years, in the dry air of the Central Asian deserts, and the high thin air of the Pamirs, and the evening air of the caravanserai courtyard, where the camels were unloaded and hobbled for the night. The sound of the bells dying away as the animals settled, the silence after, the stars coming out above the open courtyard in the absolute dry dark of the high plateau, and somewhere in the shadows of the courtyard, a merchant from Samarkand counting his goods, a monk from India reciting a sutra, a woman writing a letter she does not know will never be read. The road is not gone. I want to be clear about this before we leave it, because the Silk Road did not end, it transformed. The sea routes that replaced the overland routes from the 16th century onward were not a different thing but a continuation of the same impulse. The impulse to connect the world's civilizations for the purpose of exchange, to carry goods and ideas and diseases and stories between people who would otherwise have no contact. The container ships that today carry the world's goods across the oceans are the direct successors of the merchant galleys that replaced the Silk Road caravans, which were themselves the successors of the camel trains that first carried Chinese silk to the Mediterranean. The network has changed its form, has grown vastly larger and faster and more efficient, but the network is the same network. What has changed is the scale and the visibility of what moves. We know, now, that our world is connected. The pandemic of 2020 demonstrated this with brutal clarity. A pathogen in a city in China reached every country in the world within weeks, travelling by air in the bodies of international travellers in a way that was different in speed, but not in kind from the way the Black Death travelled along the Silk Road in the 14th century. The world is connected. The question has never been whether the world would be connected. Human beings are too mobile and too curious for the world to remain divided. But how, and at what cost, and for whose benefit, and with what wisdom? The merchants and pilgrims and monks and soldiers and refugees who walked and rode and stumbled along the routes of the Silk Road for 1,000 years did not think of themselves as making history. They thought of themselves as doing what they had to do, getting the goods to the next market, reaching the next holy site. finding a place where the political situation was less dangerous. The history was the accumulation of all those individual intentions, none of which was directed at producing a history. The Buddhism that now shapes 1 billion lives travelled because individual monks believed their scriptures were worth carrying over the Pamirs. The mathematics that underlies modern science arrived in Europe because individual scholars believed certain texts were worth translating into Arabic and then into Latin. The plague arrived in Europe because individual fleas believed individual rats were worth biting. The road does not judge its cargo. It carries what it is given. What we give it, what we have always given it, and what we give it still, is everything. Everything we know, and everything we fear, and everything we love. The road carries all of it, indifferently, westward and eastward, and everywhere between, as it has done for as long as human beings have been moving across the surface of the earth, and needing, for reasons they could not always articulate, to know what lay on the other side of the next mountain range. The caravanserai stands empty now, but the stars above it are the stars of Central Asia, and they are still the same stars. And the courtyard is still a place where, if you stood there in the right frame of mind, you might hear something, the ghost of a language you don't speak, the shadow of a story you don't know the ending of, the memory of a fire that burned here for 1,000 years and is not quite out. I think, often, about what it means to have been part of a network this large and this old without knowing it. The Sogdian merchant in Chang'an did not think of himself as a link in a civilizational chain. He thought of himself as a man trying to sell silk and buy ceramics and get home safely to Samarkand. The Buddhist monk crossing the Pamirs did not think of himself as transmitting a religion across a continent. He thought of himself as a man trying to reach a library that held the texts his tradition needed. The woman writing her letter in the watchtower did not think of herself as producing a historical document. She thought of herself as a daughter who needed her mother, and yet the sum of all their individual journeys, all their individual transactions, all their individual beliefs and fears and desires, was the thing we look back on from this distance and call the Silk Road. The network did not exist at the scale at which any individual traveller experienced it. It existed only at the scale of history, visible only from above, only from the accumulated record of 10,000 individual lives moving in the same directions, for the same reasons, across 1,000 years. We are not so different from them. We move through networks we do not fully perceive, carrying goods and ideas and diseases and stories between places we understand only partially, changing the world in ways we will not live to see fully understood. The camel bells are different bells now. The road has a different surface, but the movement is the same movement, and the exchange is the same exchange. And the human need that drives it, the need to know what is on the other side of the mountain, to carry something of value to someone who needs it, to find in the encounter with the different and the distant something that could not be found at home. That need is as present and as powerful as it has ever been. The courtyard is empty. The stars are the same. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.